Thank you very much, and I now welcome representatives from the Australian Federation of Airline Pilots. I understand the information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses has been provided to you. For the record, could you state your names and the capacity in which you appear today?
Okay. My name is Simon John Lutton. I'm the Executive Director of the Australian Federation of Air Pilots.
And my name's Naomi Radke. I'm a former captain of a jet airliner and I work for the Australian Federation of Air Pilots as a safety and technical officer now.
Fantastic. What I might do is I might ask you to take those microphones and bring them closer to you if you can, and also just speak as loudly as you can without shouting, but because we're just trying to make sure everyone can hear in this room with the AV equipment we have. Thank you again for that. You do have an opportunity to make an opening statement if you'd like, and then we'll go to questions. Would you like to make an opening statement?
Thank you, Senator. I've got a short opening statement.
Thank you.
Firstly, just in terms of who we are, the Australian Federation of Air Pilots is the largest professional body and union for commercial pilots in Australia. We've got about 5,500 members who are all professional pilots. We represent their interests. In particular, we have a concern for safety and technical matters. We have a staff of about 4 qualified pilots who work for us on an employed basis to help make submissions and put reports forward for the furthering of safety. That's our primary concern in these matters. In support of our verbal submissions today, we put forward a more detailed submission which covered issues to do with airports around Australia, and we also included a copy of a letter that we sent to the CASA Director of Aviation, Ms Pip Spence, on the 17th of March 2022, titled Normalising Tailwind Operations, Politics Threatening Aviation Safety. I think both of those submissions have been placed on the Senate website. While our submissions cover a range of issues, the AFAP is particularly concerned about any potential move away from the internationally accepted limits for tailwind approach and landings. Currently, the internationally accepted criteria for the selection of appropriate runway is a limit of 5 knots tailwind, including gusts. This is an International Civil Aviation Organisation, or ICAO, standard. Australia is a signatory to ICAO. Wind direction is the primary criteria used for the selection of the runway, and therefore the direction from which an aircraft takes off and an aircraft lands. In simple terms, it is far safer to take off and land into a headwind. It is far less safe to take off and land with a tailwind. This is one of the reasons ICAO has set an international benchmark of no more than 5 knots tailwind. The AFAP is concerned about ongoing lobbying to change this benchmark, particularly in the case of Brisbane Airport. We believe the intention of this lobbying is a desire to increase the use of runway operations over Moreton Bay instead of over housing surrounding the airport. Our concern is this lobbying fails to properly consider the safety implications. Australian pilots are trained and encouraged to perform a go-around whenever they are not fully stable coming into land. Landing with a tailwind increases the likelihood of a go-around. It is the AFAP's considered view that the higher the tailwind, the greater the likelihood of the need to perform a go-around. Increasing the tailwind limit will reduce safety buffers and increase the occurrence of go-arounds, which will create greater noise to surrounding suburbs. In the case of Brisbane Airport, given the predominant traffic flow from the south, it will also increase fuel burn. Obviously, myself, I'm not a qualified pilot. I'm employed as the Executive Director of the AFAP, but with me is Captain Naomi Radke. She is a former 737 pilot for both Ansett originally and more recently as a training captain with Virgin Australia. Captain Radke is well placed to answer any questions the Senate committee may have regarding the operational and safety issues faced by Australian airline pilots when flying into Australian airports, including Brisbane Airport. That concludes my opening statement.
Well, thank you very much for evidence, and on behalf of the committee, thank you for all the service you do as pilots to keep us safe in the skies, and we really appreciate that frank advice, and it's very clear, it helps a lot. I'll start with Senator McKenzie.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much for your evidence and keeping us all safe, those that fly all the time. Could the AFAP comment on the specific ways that you believe Air Services Australia is prioritising politics over safety?
It's detailed in that letter our concern was that there seemed to be some sort of indication given to the community that there would be further operations over Moreton Bay. And from our point of view, that's fine as long as it's safe to do so. We don't have a concern with all of the flights going over Moreton Bay as long as it's safe to do so. And what that means is you wouldn't be sending them from across the bay with a tailwind of greater than 5 knots, because that's an ICAO standard. So I think our concern was that both the Brisbane Airport and Air Services, at least implicitly, if not explicitly, misled the community into when they were doing the consultations regarding the airport. And we became aware of this push to divert more aircraft over the bay and then, by default, raise the internationally accepted tailwind limit to 10 knots and then perhaps 7 knots. And we're not in favour of that in of itself, because that will undermine safety. It will cause a situation where it'll be less safe for pilots, it will increase the workload, it will increase the number of go-arounds, and it will reduce the safety buffers. So we would be suggesting that other measures would be more appropriate than to increase the tailwind.
So what are those, how do you propose that Air Services Australia could better manage the aircraft without compromising safety?
I can probably answer that. I can't obviously speak for what Air Services can actually make the decision on. However, there are other measures in place, and they've been talked about today already. Changing a flight path to try and mitigate noise, as long as all the factors are taken into consideration. Safety coming in from 1,000 feet down to landing, or if the landing isn't appropriate to go around, is the factor. So the tailwind increase is not really a great option, and it takes us away from all the built-in performance margins that pilots like to work to. So when I've operated into Sydney with a curfew, I've operated in Sydney with sod props. We are talking a lot about approach and landing, but there also is takeoffs. There is measures in place already for noise abatement, for two types of noise abatement takeoffs, where the aircraft try and get higher as fast as they can by using full length on the runway, as well as using higher engine thrust to get away from the ground quicker, to take the noise away higher. So that's also options. So all options are available, but only if that has had full consideration of the safety effect of it.
And it's your submission to us today that hasn't been undertaken, of all these different mechanisms that are available on how to get in and out of Brisbane in a plane and minimise the noise impact.
Yes, Senator.
Without compromising.
Yes, it's our understanding there's been no safety case performed on the proposal for increasing the tailwind limit.
Okay.
Sorry, could you say that again?
To our knowledge, there's been no safety case that's been generated to justify increasing the tailwind limit.
Maybe you can take this on notice. On page 42 of the post-implementation review, or the final report on the PIR, I think this is an Air Service Australia document. It says a safety case was submitted to CASA on the 29th of April 2022 to increase the existing 5-knot tailwind limit for sod drops operations at Brisbane Airport to 7 knots. CASA is still considering the submission. Now, this report was December 2022, I think, so I'm not sure what's happened since then. But maybe you could take that on notice, or do you know about that, or you're not aware of that?
I'm not aware of that.
Okay, all right. Well, if you could take that on notice, that'd be great. Thanks. Sorry, Senator McKenzie.
Can you provide examples where noise abatement has directly conflicted with safety priorities?
Well, one would be increasing the tailwind above 5 knots, because an aircraft handles differently because you're coming across the ground faster. So you're actually touching down at a higher speed, use more runway. There's more likelihood of an aircraft floating in a tailwind landing. And
what does floating mean?
Floating means, I'll go back one little bit. We have a touchdown zone that you need to touch down the aeroplane, which all the performance factors are determined on. if you don't touch down in that zone, then you're supposed to go around and do the whole approach again. When you come into a flare, the aeroplane settles down to the runway, you reduce thrust and you touch down. A float means with a tailwind, and changing tailwind amounts is more chance of a float, where you therefore have a higher chance of actually making a go around. So back to the question of has it been other things looked into? Obviously, it is happening around the country, but we haven't had discussions, as far as I know, exactly with our services on input into actual different ideas to try and reduce, the effect of the noise.
Okay, and I just, sorry, can I,
As far
my
as I
last
know.
question.
Yeah.
Mr Lutton or Captain, have either of you met with the Minister's office?
I've attended a roundtable in Canberra with a number of other participants in the industry. So
And who was at that roundtable?
The roundtable had representatives of airports, representatives of the airlines, representatives of other unions such as the engineers, and it was a cross-section.
TWU, were they there?
Yes, they were.
Yep. Any community groups?
No, there wasn't at that roundtable.
And when was that roundtable?
I cannot remember exactly, but it was probably about a year and a bit ago.
Yep, okay. And have you sought to have meetings with the Minister or her office?
Yes, we have. We've written to the Minister's office to organise a meeting directly between our President, Captain Louise Poll,
Yep.
myself, and that meeting didn't eventuate. We received responses deferring it, but we haven't actually had the opportunity. Our President is a working commercial pilot, so it's
Floating.
yeah, it floated
It's
away.
a floating invitation.
Yes. We
So
haven't quite landed it
just to
yet.
be clear, because we don't want to verbal the Minister or her office. So when did the pilot seek a meeting with Minister King?
It would have been a significant time ago. It would have been well over a year ago that we, probably shortly after she was appointed
say
as the
g'day,
transport.
here we are.
Yeah, we generally try and organise a meeting with the incoming Transport Minister, and we do it with both sides of politics, obviously.
I'll give you my card.
Great.
Thank you, Senator Mackenzie. Senator Waters.
Thank you, Chair. Hello, folks. Thanks for your time and all of the expertise in keeping us all safe in the air. And great to see some female captains being represented, so thank you again. Can I just ask, please, on this tailwind change proposal, does anybody know who submitted that request to CASA to change it from 5 to 7 knots per hour? Because it seems to me like a bit of an elaborate way of avoiding a curfew.
As far as I know, it was a joint from Air Services and Brisbane Airport Corporation. Yeah.
Okay. All right, well, we'll keep an eye on that. Captain Radke, you mentioned that you'd operated both under SOD props and under a curfew in Sydney Airport. Does the Federation have a view on the desirability of a curfew from community perspective, also from the perspective of you as those flying?
Pilots are acutely aware of the noise we create, and we take it very seriously to follow any procedures that have been put in place to try and reduce the effect of that as best we can. And pilots do live in noise-affected areas as well, so we're very aware of it. From a curfew point of view, it is an option. It also has different complexities attached to it, and also a consequence of increased pressure, because especially if you're at the edge of it, if you're getting close to it coming in force on approach, it adds an element of pressure to the pilot, because if you don't, in Sydney, if you don't land by the curfew time, you need to carry extra fuel to go to another destination, which in itself is what we train for. However, the decision-making process leading up to that is taken very seriously and takes the capacity. That compared to SOD props themselves, even though they're used, they have pilots on high alert, because you're taking off in a direction for an oncoming aircraft, and probably as close, in effect, as cars passing on a road, but this is aircraft where other things can happen because we're in three-dimensional. And if you move, and actually 4 if you add in the airspace moving around. So, and if any problem on a takeoff or any problem as an aircraft coming in to intercept an approach, both coming in like this, it actually, is a high, although it's done, it also is a challenging thing for us to be aware of. So what's better and what's worse, it's hard to say without, doing further research and getting data. We know the data on the tailwind, and it's actually in the letter from 2012, some Boeing data about runway overruns globally. For winds over 5 knots tailwind, it's 42% has been part of the reason. So tailwind needs to be taken seriously. The next stage is around that, and I understand trying to reduce it as best we can by doing as many mitigations as we can. I'd say, the curfew, I might understand it from the community's point of view, I can't say that, but a curfew for a pilot is doable, but it has increased complexity.
Okay, thank you for that. Can I just ask now about the full runway usage trial? There's been some discussion about the parameters of the trial basically being designed to fail because you weren't changing the destination height. Therefore, the trajectory was essentially irrelevant, as I understand it as a layperson. So can I ask, if the height was increased, what is the gradient that is safe but achievable as a pilot, a takeoff gradient?
That depends on the aircraft, because every aircraft performance is different. I wasn't actually part of that trial. No, we weren't actually involved in that trial, as far as I know. But yeah, different aircraft have different gradient, and so the actual maximum would depend on the aircraft, and it also needs to consider that's 2 engines. If it's all airliners are 2 engine. If an engine failed, which is a really low risk, but it is there for consideration in the actual gradient. So I don't want to give you a number. I can do the approach gradient because that's set, but the takeoff gradient depends on the aircraft. And in a tailwind takeoff, what I can say is the gradient will be flatter because you've got the tailwind to account that is pushing the aircraft along faster and flatter.
Yep, understand. Thank you. Now, I understand there's some air traffic controller shortages. Is that impacting pilots' ability to navigate the air safely? And is that impacting optimising flight paths to reduce noise?
Yes, Senator, that has been a very big issue for the AFAP for quite a while. The insufficient number of air traffic controllers and the use, and I know that the senators are aware of this, of TIBA is something that we've found extremely frustrating at the AFAP, and we've made submissions about that to air services and to anyone that will listen about the degradation of airspace and the introduction of TIBA.
So for those playing along at home, TIBA is a significant issue. Did you just want to briefly explain what happens? Because this is a game played by Air Services Australia that's appalling.
Yes, I can explain TIBA airspace. It stands for Traffic Information Broadcast by Aircraft. And basically what would normally be controlled airspace, controlled by air traffic controllers, and mostly a lot where jet airliners and propellered airliners are flying, changes to, because of staff shortages, will change to TIBA, where the pilots have to separate their aircraft from another pilot's aircraft. We've had examples where international aircraft have come in, didn't even know what TIBA was, which is concerning. Not from their airline point of view, just because it's such a unique problem we're having here in Australia, as well as it's happened between Sydney and Brisbane. It's quite often it can happen. It's been happening north of Brisbane, but between Sydney and Brisbane, we've got data where it's occurred on a major route where aircraft are having to separate from each other, and that
without an air traffic controller telling them where to go. So it's like being
pilots
on an actual road,
yeah.
visually.
So you're on your own.
As well as the driver.
Yeah, so you're doing both roles, and Yeah, that's. I was going to say something else, but I've just lost it. So.
Well, can I just ask, whose responsibility is that to fix that shortage, and what are Air Services Australia doing about it?
So the shortage of controllers is from Air Services, obviously not providing enough staff, and whatever the reasons are, there's not enough. So how it affects pilots is airlines are just not sending. If it's known about TIBA coming into effect, airlines aren't sending their aircraft through TIBA, so they have to reroute around it, and that increases fuel burn highly. And if it's known about before, pilots can put that fuel on before they leave, but if it happens in the air, then that can be an issue. So it is staffing numbers. So I think back to the original question about the noise flight path. If they don't have enough controllers, managing those flight paths is made more difficult.
Like they say they're so concerned about safety, and that's why they can't do anything about noise, and yet they're not putting the staff on to deal with safety. None of this adds up.
Yeah, this has been concerning us for a while. We've been writing a lot about this. So,
Yeah. Thank you.
So, what is Senator Colbeck?
Thanks. Look, I just want to go back to the 5 knots tailwind question. So that's an international standard, and so effectively what happens is that pilots everywhere operate to that standard.
Yes, Senator, that is. There will be occasions when there is exceptions, but they are very much the exceptions. That is the ICAO standard, is what's applied at all of the airports around Australia.
So what would be the circumstance that would create the exception?
I was talking to Naomi earlier, she might be able to explain it earlier, but for example, if there was a large terrain in front of the airport, it may be decided that it was a safer option, or near the airport, a safer option to have marginally higher tailwind than to be encroaching into that higher terrain, for example, if there was an airport of that sort of nature. And there may be occasions when it's lifted for air freight on the edge of a curfew, is what my understanding. We asked that exact question internally about when is there exceptions to this, and there's very few, and they were the 2 that were given to me. Naomi may be able to explain a bit more.
yeah, so it's all about making it the safest outcome. So the safest outcome on its very small occasions of airports around the world is where the terrain itself means that taking off away from the terrain and landing towards the terrain makes the airport like a one-way strip almost, and that's where the small occasions that then an increased tailwind can occur. But it's all about limits. Aircraft limits they call it an envelope, the amount of the scope the aeroplane can go. Pilots and airlines don't fly to those limits, and their limits are there based on data to stay away from all the limits unless it's an emergency or there's a higher pressing reason to do it. And so that's why we stay away from noise limits, and the 5 knot limit has plenty of data as to why that should stay that way.
Okay, so in an international system, pilots would expect to be flying to the international standard, and if they're not flying to the international standard, there would need to be a well understood and published exception to the processes that they would apply to that airport, which would mean an additional layer of operational requirement for a pilot preparing for a flight into that port.
Yes, some airports actually have different category levels, and depending on their complexity, and that sort of airport would have different training for the pilots, possibly even additional simulator training for any airports like that, especially if it's a terrain reason for it.
No, but in the operation of a system more broadly, the less exemptions you have, the less opportunity there is for error to occur, and therefore the safer the system is to operate.
Yes, Senator, that's exactly correct. And pilots operate to international standards, and any deviation from those standards needs to be carefully thought about, and there has to be good justification for it, and there would be more complexity and more training required for the pilots. So back to your original point, yes, it's much more appropriate to have benchmarks and international standards applied universally than making any deviations to those standards.
And so as someone who flies a bit, my KPI for you is number of landings equals takeoffs equals number of landings. you would want a system with the least variation in it possible to be the most safest.
That's correct, Senator.
Yeah, okay. That's the point that I want to make. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Colbeck. Can I just go back to this safety case issue? As we've established, there was a safety case prepared, and indeed on the Air Services Australia website on the 20th of April 2022, they say that Air Services Australia and Brisbane Airport Corporation have been working jointly to develop a safety case to increase the tailwind limit for sod drops from 5 knots to 7 knots. I mean, clearly given your evidence, but I just want to clarify, you weren't consulted as a part of that safety case submission?
Not to my knowledge, we weren't consulted at all. If you look at our letter prior to that date, 17th of March, we were certainly aware that there was lobbying to do this, but we weren't involved in it across it, and we made our position in that letter of the 17th of March.
Who was that letter to? Sorry, to Air Service?
It was to Pip Spence, to CASA.
To CASA, okay. So just to be clear, your submission says you're the largest pilot association in Australia. You represent them more pilots than anyone else?
Yes, there's actually two. Well, we're the largest and we're the first. There is another one called the Australian and International Pilots Association, which is another. But for safety and technical matters, we work together with them. And that's why the letter is called AusALPA, because when we're on safety and technical matters, we partner up and the two groups come together and we'll represent over 7,000 Australian pilots. When you put the two groups together, it's over 7. And that letter was an AusALPA letter written by both the two largest Australian pilot associations.
So, you worked together on that, and that group wasn't consulted then, just to be clear.
Exactly. We became aware of this sort of push to do it, and it concerned us gravely, and we wrote that 10-page submission.
I mean, this is almost a rhetorical question, but would you expect a safety case involving a significant change to the operation of aircraft to require, would you think that best practice around that safety case would require the consultation with the Pilots Association?
We certainly would. So the pilots are the ones flying the aircraft in the area, so you would think that particularly any deviation from international standards would have to involve the Pilots Association. And to my knowledge, and I'm the Executive Director and Naomi works in our safety and technical, there was no engagement with the AFAP.
I actually have an update on this. This is concerning me greatly, as you'd expect, and I've just done some quick research here while sitting here. And on October the 9th last year, an article in Australian Aviation is titled "Brisbane Airport Noise Breakthrough After Tailwind Deal." And the news article says that Singapore, Emirates and Cathay Pacific have agreed to fly in tailwinds of up to 7 knots at Brisbane Airport in a bid to alleviate aircraft noise for locals. So you're not aware of that either. Obviously, that's you don't represent pilots from those organisations. But they've done a deal with Brisbane Airport to do this. Does that concern you? Well, if that's true, I imagine it's true, but it's just something I've seen.
Would you expect to be notified? Would you expect to be notified if there is a change in the conditions for flying into an airport? I mean, if there is, there's a standard. You're all training to and operating to a standard. There's a change to the application of the standard. Shouldn't there be some form of notification process to you as an organisation? Captain Radke, you're training pilots. Wouldn't a standard part of the application of the standard be to notify that there's been a modification to the standard for a particular airport?
Senator, I think we'd be notified. The issue is we weren't consulted about it. So I'd expect that if it did come into place, that it would be published, but it hasn't yet come into place, to my knowledge. And obviously, once it's published, but the issue for us is that we weren't involved in any consultation regarding it, but we placed our view anyway.
I'm not arguing with that either side of it, but surely if there's an article saying that it's changed, there should be some notification process to you and as an organisation that there is a change. That would seem to be a complete failure of the system if there wasn't.
Yeah, well, if when a change occurs, I think all operators and all pilots will be notified of that at that point in time, but there hasn't been a change at the moment.
All right, Senator Mackenzie, quick follow-up.
Very quick. Just on that deal article, Singapore, Emirates and Cathay, are they all in a one world type an alliance?
I'm uncertain as for the airlines, but from a union point of view,
That's all right.
I
I'll
don't
ask
believe
Qantas.
so. Yeah.
Thank you.
Just finally from me, we had some discussion earlier today about continuous descent operations, and that potential is a way to reduce noise. Apparently there's like a step down at the moment into the Brisbane airport.
Yeah.
Have you got any feedback on that? Is that a viable technique to reduce noise?
Yeah, definitely, because it's making it more efficient to be able to fly that. But the flight paths have to match that process and match all aircraft types to that are likely to use it. Pilots would prefer to do a continuous descent rather than keep
Sounds
levelling
easy.
off, because it changes profile calculations, and profile being you need to end up at the runway at the right height and the right speed, and you're working from that all the way back, all the way down the descent. So continuous descent profile with gates to meet, like altitude gates and speed gates, would be helpful.
Right. There was some talk of the current flight paths into Brisbane being dirty, or described by pilots as being dirty. Is that some description you've heard? And if so, what does that mean?
Means that possibly there's lots of level outs, and having to recalculate each time would be what they would mean,
Right.
I expect, by dirty.
Okay. Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much. That's very useful evidence. We really appreciate you coming along, and I think may have been one question taken on notice. We're asking for any information back by the 6th of May, if that's possible, and enjoy the rest of your day.